Hello, everyone, and welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about animal complexity and the different body plans that animals can exhibit. And this is chapter 9 in your textbook. All animals on Earth exhibit one of 5 levels of complexity, and these 5 levels include the protoplasmic, cellular, cell tissue, tissue organ, and organ system level of complexity. And these levels are actually in a hierarchy. So as you go from level to level, it becomes more complex. So each level is more complex than the last. The first stage, first level of complexity is called protoplasmic, and animals that fit within this level of organization are single cellular. So a good example of this are paramecium, and with them being single cellular, everything that is vital to their survival must occur within themselves. So all the organelles are responsible for carrying out all the vital functions for that organism to live. So you can imagine with so much riding on your intracellular environment to survive, there is a high level of organization that is involved with these organisms. This stage, this level of complexity, is the only level where we can see these organisms survive on their own. So once we go after we go from this stage and get more and more complex, the cells cannot survive on their own. In this case, these are it's the only level where we see animal cells living and thriving on their own. The next stage up are cellular is the cellular stage. And this is when we have different cells that have differentiated will aggregate together for kind of like communal survival. So each of the cells that are involved in this community have a specific function and they all kind of contribute, almost if you thought about a town. Each store in the town has its own function that allows the town to work. That's essentially kind of how this is organized. And these cells are strongly associated with each other because they are requiring each other to survive. However, they are not linked together, so they're not bound together. And a good example of this are volvox, and we'll talk about volvox very soon. The next level of complexity up is the cell tissue level of organization. And this is characterized by the presence of tissues. And this is essentially when cells will aggregate together and now they're close, even more closely associated with each other. They rely on each other. They're even attached, like you can see in this image here. These cells are connected to one another through junctions and things like that, right? To form a tissue. All the cells within the tissue perform the same function. So they're all working together. Some cell tissue organisms may exhibit a cellular stage of complexity at one point or to some degree, but the presence of tissues is really what defines this level of organization. Next, we have our tissue organ level of organization, and this is characterized by the presence of organs. And this is when you have various tissues working together to form an organ. And so there are a couple types of tissues that make an organ possible. You have your parenchyma cells that are parenchyma tissue, and those are the cells that are responsible for doing most of the work of that particular organ. And then you have your stromal cells, and these cells are more like structural. They provide support for the parenchyma cells. And then organs are more specialized than tissues. So we're kind of moving up in complexity, but we're also moving up in specialization. And then the final level of organization, which is the most complex, are organisms that have organ systems. And this is when you have various organs that work together to make an organism possible. And most animals are living that we can think of, or most animals on the earth, exhibit organ system levels um, of organization. There are 11 organ systems that we recognize in the animal kingdom. So now we're going to look at the body plans as it relates to symmetry. Within the animal kingdom, there are 3 types of symmetry that you can observe. The first we're going to talk about is spherical symmetry, and this is where you can draw a plane or split an organism in half, if you will, almost anywhere. And as long as it's in half, you can get 2 mirrored halves. So, for example, if we use this organism's picture here, we can draw a plane splitting this organism in half that way, and it will give us two mirrored equivalent halves. Same thing as here or here or here. And no matter where, if you split it in half along that axis in that plane, you'll get two equivalent equal halves. This form of symmetry is actually rare in animals, and really only a few unicellular animals have this form of symmetry. The next form of symmetry that you can see in animals is radial symmetry, and this is where you can draw two or more planes through the animal to get two similar halves, mirrored halves. And so this is different from spherical in that you can't draw it just anywhere, but you can still draw multiple planes. So in the case of the sea anemone here, we can divide the organism along this plane, and you'd get two equal mirrored halves. Same thing along this plane or this plane, this plane. And there's even like planes in between these planes, right? Where you can divide the organism in half and get two mirrored equal halves. Within the radial symmetry, we do have some organisms that are biradial. So you can really only draw two lines through this organism and get two mirrored halves. So radial, two, generally two or more. Biradial is two specifically. And some organisms that exhibit this form of symmetry are cnidarians, ctenophores, and echinoderms, which are our jellyfish, our ctenophores, and then our sea urchins. There we go. And so we'll talk a lot more in detail about those as we're going through the semester. And then finally, we have our bilateral organisms. And these are organisms that you can only divide using one plane and get two mirrored halves. And so when you're looking at this ladybug here, we can only divide this ladybug in half along this axis. Sorry, I probably should draw it in green. Along this axis here to get two mirrored halves. I can't divide this organism this way and get two mirrored halves, right? Because the top half and the bottom half, they don't look the same. They're not mirrored halves. Same thing with this way, right? They're not mirrored halves. So with a bilateral organism, you can only divide it using one plane, and this will give you the right and left halves of the organism. Most animals exhibit this form of symmetry, and it's strongly associated with cephalization or the development of a head. So, to get into more detail, when you have a bilaterally symmetrical organism, it's not like you can only divide it in half with one plane. You can only divide in half with one plane to get two mirrored parts, but you can divide the organism using other planes to get different regions of that animal. So there are three planes that we have. We have our sagittal plane, which is what we just kind of talked about, splitting it down the middle to get two even halves. And that's represented here by this blue plane, right? So if you imagine that cat, imagine you're looking at that cat head on, it's splitting it down the middle. So, and it results in two regions, the left and right half of the organism. So you also have the frontal plane, which is represented here by this pink line, and it will divide the animal into its dorsal and ventral halves. So its back and its belly, essentially. And then our last plane is the transverse plane. And so this divides the animal kind of down the middle. So imagine a line through the middle of your stomach. And this transverse plane will result in the regions of your anterior region and your posterior region. So it divides the top half from the bottom half. In addition to our three major planes, we also assess regions of a bilateral animal relative to the midline. So the midline of the animal, when we're talking about that sagittal plane, is called the medial, right? So it's the middle. And the closer a region is to, or closer the part of the animal is to the midline, it's called proximal. And the further away it is, it's called distal. So give you guys an example. I'm going to draw a person. Okay. So this guy or girl or whatever, If we draw our sagittal plane down the middle, we've now divided this human in half, and this medial is the medial line. The shoulder of this person, which is crudely drawn here, is proximal to the medial, and the person's hand is distal, right? Because it's further away from the midline. Same thing with, let's say, your hip joint versus your foot, right? So proximal, closer to the midline, distal, further from the midline. With that said, you've reached the end of the chapter on the animal complexity and body plans. And I just wanted to give you a good summary of some of the vocabulary and concepts you need to make sure that you understand going forward. For the rest of the semester, these terms will come up. So you want to make sure that you understand them. The first are related to the germ layers. What is diploblastic versus triploblastic? Also understanding what's the difference between a protostome and a deuterostome. Understanding what's the difference between an acoelomate, a pseudocoelomate, and a coelomate, and then what is the difference between a coelom that's formed via the schizocoelous or intercoelous method. Also understanding what's the difference between an animal that exhibits spherical versus radial versus bilateral symmetry. And finally, understanding what segmentation is and what that can mean for an animal's development, and understanding the process of gut development, right? So how we talked about the archenteron and things like that. How does a gut develop? An incomplete gut versus a complete gut. So make sure that you understand all of this vocabulary and what all these terms mean. I recommend you go ahead and read Chapter 9, Sections 9.1 and 9.2, and also 9.4, and then do the Smart Book Assessment for Chapter 9. Alrighty, one more lecture and then we're off to our exam. I hope everything is going well and all of your studying is going well. See you soon.